WWE has long been a global company with fans from all over the world, and this is something which has been reflected in their roster over the years. Yes, whether it's in the East, the West, or something in between, every part of the planet is represented by WWE. But who are the greatest international stars in WWE history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Canada's own Chris Jericho. Yes, this is a man who, while in WWE, became a 6-time world champion and the person to hold the Intercontinental title on a total of 9 separate occasions, a record for that particular piece of hardware. And that's not all that makes him a legend. No, there's also his litany of classic matches against the likes of Shawn Michaels, Kurt Angle, Kevin Owens, and many, many more. Sure, he might not wrestle for WWE anymore. No, as things stand today, he's joined All Elite Wrestling, and with it seeming like he's going to be there for the foreseeable future, we don't anticipate him showing up again on Raw or SmackDown anytime soon. But that doesn't mean his legacy in WWE doesn't remain intact. Hell, if he were to show up tomorrow, he'd no doubt get a hero's welcome, and while we're not sure he'd be in the world title mix at this stage of the game, he'd certainly be able to help build up some new up-and-coming act and turn them into a top-level star, as he's done multiple times in the past. Really, when the book is eventually written on WWE, Chris Jericho will have earned his spot in the chapter about greatest international stars they ever had, with him quite possibly even earning the spot of the greatest of them all. But he isn't the only Canadian star who made WWE his home for much of his career. No, there have been plenty of others who have done this too over the years, and perhaps the most notable example of this would be our next subject, Bret Hitman Hart. That's right, the Hitman is possibly the greatest wrestler to ever lace up a pair of boots. So great was Bret, in fact, back in the mid-90s when Vince McMahon was looking for someone to fill the void of top star left by an exiting Hulk Hogan, it would be he who was chosen for the spot. And this was doubly impressive because he was not an American as Hulkster had been before him. Rather, he hailed from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. That's right, the excellence of execution was a proud man of the Great White North, to the point that he'd always make this known whenever he was on screen. It didn't matter if the company he worked for was based in the United States, he was a Canadian hero, and he wanted everyone to remember that. So much would he play up to this, in fact, in 1997 when he turned heel, he'd refused to do so in his home country. And that led to the truly unique situation throughout that year where he alternated between being a heel or a face, depending on what side of the border he was on that week. And then of course there's Montreal, the place where the infamous screwjob happened in November of that year. The fact that Bret was so proud of being a Canadian was a big part of what brought that whole situation to a boil on that particular evening. But then he had every right to be proud because at this point in time, there was a solid argument to be made that he was the most famous athlete in the entire country. Yes, when it comes down to it, the best there is, the best there was, and the best there ever will be might be the person wrestling fans will associate with Canada the most for the rest of time because being from there was such a big part of his identity. But what about a family member of his? Surely he was proud of where he came from too, right? Why, yes he was, to the point that it was even part of his name. That's right, it's time for us to talk about the British Bulldog. Now, if you were to head over to the UK today and poll 100 wrestling fans about who the most famous performer to ever come out of that country was, a large number would tell you it was Davey Boy Smith. What made Davey Boy so great? Well, because he was able to rise out of his hometown, the same one which gave the world people like boxing champion Tyson Fury, actors Ian McKellen and Ben Kingsley, and bands like the Smiths and Oasis, to go all the way to America and wrestle for the biggest company out there, the company then known as the World Wrestling Federation. And he wouldn't just be another member of the roster here. No, the Bulldog would quickly find a fan base there, enough for him to become a big-time babyface, whether this be as part of a tag team alongside the Dynamite Kid, as part of a stable alongside the Hart Foundation, or as a solo act. Seriously, it didn't matter what role Vince McMahon put the Englishman in, he always delivered. And this would all eventually culminate in his most famous moment when, in the summer of 1992, when WWF took their second biggest show of the year, SummerSlam, to the hallowed grounds of Wembley Stadium in London, England, he'd not only main event the evening against his brother-in-law Bret Hart, but he'd beat him to become the Intercontinental Champion. Needless to say then, this was a moment that had remained an iconic one for the WWE in the years since, and it's kept the boy from Manchester in the role of beloved legend ever since. Sure, he might not be with us to enjoy that status anymore as he's no longer with us, but his fans will always remember him as possibly being the greatest British wrestler ever. Could someone ever usurp his role? We suppose it's possible. Drew McIntyre is certainly approaching that level now, and who knows who might come after him. But as it stands today, we'll go with Davey Boy Smith as the best representative of the UK. But what about the Emerald Isle, the land which sits right next to the UK, the Republic of Ireland? They must have had plenty of great names wrestle for WWE in the past, right? Why, yes they have, and one of them is our next subject as it happens, the man who goes by the name of Sheamus. Yes, this is a man who became WWE Champion mere months into his main roster run back in 2009 when he beat John Cena for the accolade. And that wouldn't be the end of the Dublin native's wins in WWE over the years. No, as the 2000s turned into the 2010s, he'd proved to be something of a mainstay there, not always at the tippy top of the card, but usually somewhere near it. Hell, at one point, he'd even get to semi-main event WrestleMania with Triple H when he took on the Game at WrestleMania 24. And after that, he'd continue to be an important weapon in WWE's arsenal, so much so that before all was said and done, he'd win the world title on 3 further occasions and would even win the Royal Rumble in 2012. Then of course there's his work in the tag team division. Yes, not just content to be a singles act, Sheamus has also proven himself to be a bit of a specialist when it comes to duos action too over the years, with his most famous work in this area probably coming during the time he was partnered up with Cesaro as one half of The Bar. But this hasn't been his only notable partner. No, there have been people like Drew McIntyre, Pete Dunne, and even the other members of the League of Nations at one point in Alberto Del Rio, Rusev, and Wade Barrett. All of this is to say then that when you think of great Irish wrestlers, at least in terms of the men's division, then you probably think of Sheamus first, as his resume speaks for itself. And it's not a resume which looks like it's going to be finished up anytime soon either. No, after having something of a late career resurgence during the 2020s, the Pale Man has his sights set on doing the one thing he's yet to do before he retires, and that's win the Intercontinental title. Will he achieve this goal before all is said and done? Probably. And when he does, it'll be a nice way to close out a legendary career. But what of the women of Ireland? Well, they have a great wrestler of their own who has worked for WWE in a prominent spot. Probably the most prominent spot of all, in fact, because we're talking about arguably the biggest star in the history of women's wrestling here, Becky Lynch. Come on now, of course we were going to talk about Becky Lynch when we talked about great international stars of WWE. And that's because, at least in terms of fame, she's pretty much reached that level of a Chris Jericho or a Bret Hart by now. Yes, ever since breaking out in a big way in the autumn of 2018 with her The Man character, a Steve Austin-esque anti-hero who won the hearts of fans everywhere, she's been redefining what it means to be a successful women's wrestler in WWE. And we mean that truly because prior to her rise, the idea that a woman could be the biggest star in the company or could do something like main event to WrestleMania seemed like a ridiculous thing to imagine. But now that she's broken through those glass ceilings, this is all possible. Hell, after she did the latter in 2019, Sasha Banks and Bianca Belair would do the exact same thing just a couple of years later in 2021. Needless to say then, this has made her a huge deal not only amongst the American fans, but also amongst those who hail from her native Ireland, as in her they can see a possibility of such a future for themselves. And this has never been more evident than in the case of Lyra Valkyria, a fellow Irish woman who made it all the way to the WWE herself after an early run-in with Lynch while she was still a trainee back in her home country. Honestly, so big of a star has Becky become now and so synonymous she has become with Irish wrestling, it's hard to imagine anyone ever taking her place in that regard. The only question left is, now that she's conquered just about every mountain she can in the industry, what else is there left for her to do? Will her remaining years in the ring see her settle into a Legends role, someone who can help to raise the next generation up? Or does she still have eyes on becoming a world champion a few more times, and maybe even main eventing the Showcase of the Immortals again? It really is up to her. And after all is said and done, maybe she'll try her hand in Hollywood where she can follow the path laid out by the likes of Dwayne Johnson, John Cena, and Dave Bautista. That's right, the sky's the limit for this native of Limerick. But she's not the only big-time women's star in current-day WWE who hails from outside the United States. No, the same statement also applies to our next subject, Australia's Rhea Ripley. Now, it's been well known for a while that while places like the UK, Canada, Mexico, and Japan have long been a hotbed for international wrestling stars to come out of, Australia and New Zealand have also been doing a great job of this too. After all, it's from these countries that in the modern day alone we've been given stars such as Bronson Reed, Dakota Kai, and Toni Storm, just to name a few. But for as big as all these names are, perhaps the biggest of all would be Rhea Ripley. Why is this? Well, because over the past few years, she's been able to break out of the pack in WWE to become one of the biggest female phenomenons they've had since the days of China back at the turn of the millennium. Yes, with her gothic look and her dominating powerhouse physique, the Nightmare has pretty much been able to make the Raw Women's division her own personal playground throughout the 2020s. And this has to be a big deal for her because, growing up in Adelaide, the world of WWE over in the United States must have seemed like a distant dream at points. But setting her sights on reaching there early on, she'd eventually be able to work her way through her local indie scene enough to the point that, in 2017, she'd finally be noticed by WWE and would be invited to take part in their inaugural Mae Young Classic tournament. And following that, it was a clear path towards superstardom, as after working her way through both NXT and NXT UK, Rhea would find herself on the main roster just in time to stand out from everyone else there and become the biggest name on the roster. Sure, it might have been a rocky start for her during those early years, but ever since Triple H took over as head of creative in 2022, the Aussie would find things falling into place for her. And that would lead to a run which has been so successful, it turned her into a surefire future WWE Hall of Famer in record time. Hell, the fact she was able to headline a PLE in her home country alone was an impressive achievement, and that moment came for her in February of 2024 when she and Nia Jax went on last at Elimination Chamber live from the city of Perth. Where will she go from here? Well, like with Becky Lynch, anywhere she wants to, whether that be inside the ring or out of it. Seriously, there's no mountain she won't be able to climb at this point if she puts her mind to it. And all the while she's doing this, her fans back in Australia will be cheering her on as she represents them on the world stage in a way that only she knows how to. But let's move away from Australia for now and head back over to Europe for a moment, as it's there we find our next great WWE performer to come from a non-American country. Who are we talking about here? Why, the pride of Austria, of course, Gunther. That's right, Gunther is an absolute phenomenon in the ring, someone who has a simple style, but an incredibly effective and believable one that's built around him using his power and devastating chops to pick apart any opponent he's put up against limb from limb. But while it's only been the past few years that he's risen to the top of WWE, his fans from prior to that will have been all too aware of how great he was from his days back when he was working the European indie circuit, primarily for West Side Extreme Wrestling in Germany, where he became a 3-time WXW Unified World Wrestling Champion. And after that, well, aside from making his name in UK and Irish indies like Progress, Rev Pro, and OTT, the man then going by the name of Walter would find himself working for the British branch of NXT. Needless to say then, he'd become a huge success there, holding that brand's world title for a total of 870 days before he dropped it in order to be called over to America full-time. And you all know what happened then. That's right. Following his main roster call-up in 2022, the man now rechristened as Gunther would embark on a 600-plus day-long run as Intercontinental Champion, a run which was so good it was able to completely revive the spirit of that belt again and return it to something much closer to the glory days it had gone through in the 80s and 90s. Really, if we're talking about mainland Europe, there is a solid argument to be made at this point that Gunther is the best to ever hail from that continent. It's hard to imagine anyone else in the modern day, at the very least, who could compete with him in this respect. And that's exactly why when WWE headed over to Germany in August of 2024 for their Bash in Berlin PLE, the Austrian would be treated like a returning hero there, because even if he was from a neighboring country, he'd made such a name for himself there so early on, he was pretty much a hometown guy. Yes, we're at a point now where Gunther is firmly reaching that status of all-time great, and this is something which is only going to make his people more and more proud as the years go on, whether those people are from Austria, Germany, or anywhere else. But there is one older figure of the industry who may be able to challenge Gunther's claim as being the best WWE wrestler from mainland Europe, a Frenchman to be precise, and the reason for that is because he's none other than the legendary Andre the Giant. That's right, when we're talking about icons of wrestling, then Andre the Giant both literally and figuratively towers above almost everyone else. And that's because, aside from being physically 7'4" and a true giant in every sense of the word, he also just happened to be one of the greatest performers to ever do it. Yes, back during the territory days, all a promoter had to do was bring the big man in once a year in order to pop a huge house, as everyone in the local area would flock to see him hit the ring. That said, for as much as he was a draw in each territory across all states, his biggest performances were always saved for WWF. So when the territory system was killed by Vince McMahon during the 80s then, Andre pretty much found a permanent home in WWF. and it was there he would run out what remained of his career. What would he do during this period? Well, how about headline what was, at the time, the biggest wrestling show ever in WrestleMania 3? That's right, we all remember the body slam heard around the world, that iconic finish to his main event against Hulk Hogan. And that alone is enough to make the Frenchman one of WWE's greatest ever international stars. Of course, that's far from all he did in WWF though. No, there are years of great moments from him outside of this. Really, it should come as no surprise that when Vince McMahon first came up with the idea of creating a Hall of Fame in 1993, it would be Andre the Giant who he'd have be the inaugural inductee. And when it came time to create a WrestleMania Battle Royal years later, it would be the big man that he named this after too. Yes, for as long as WWE is around, Andre's name will always be remembered as one of the greatest to ever do it, and with good reason too, because he really was that good. Whether we're talking about his earlier, more athletic days of the 70s, or his later run in the 80s as a final boss for the top babyface to overcome. But Andre the Giant isn't the only legendary international star who Hulk Hogan had to defeat as part of that first world title reign back during the early 80s. No, the man he would have to beat in order to win that title in the first place would also be a foreigner. Who are we talking about this time? Why, the man from Iran, the Iron Sheik, of course. That's right, arguably the greatest performer to ever come out of the Middle East, the Iron Sheik lived quite a life before he ever even set foot inside of a wrestling ring. And that's because during his younger years, he was an Olympic athlete in amateur wrestling at the 1968 Mexico Summer Games. Of course, what he's best known for today, though, is his time inside of the Squared Circle, a time which, after a period spent learning under Vern Gagne in Minnesota, would see him end up performing for the WWF. And Sheiky Baby would go all the way to the top of the mountain when he beat Bob Backlund to become world champion of that promotion in December of 1983, a rare feat for a heel. Sure, it would be a short reign with the gold, with him pretty much just serving as a transitional champion for Hulk Hogan to overcome a few weeks later, but his name would forever go down on the record books as world champions after the fact regardless. Obviously then, this has all helped to add to the legacy of the Iron Sheik being one of the greatest international stars to ever perform in WWE, and almost certainly the greatest to ever come from Iran or any of its neighboring countries. Come on now, we're talking about a guy who was not only great in the ring, but also who turned himself into something of a pop culture phenomenon post-retirement with his appearances on things like The Howard Stern Show. So it's only fitting then that when he passed away in 2023, the WWE would honor him by remembering him as one of the best wrestlers to ever walk through their halls. Yes, it's sad that he's no longer with us today to show up on Raw from time to time, but we'll just have to accept the fact that he's gone. Just as we'll also have to accept the fact that our next subject has since passed on to the Italian Superman, Bruno Sammartino. That's right, while many assume that Bruno Sammartino was an Italian-American, someone of Mediterranean heritage who was actually born in the United States, he was, in truth, from Italy originally. So, when he reached his late teens and decided he wanted to start wrestling himself, it was WWF he would look for work in, something which ended up with him getting a job pretty quickly once McMahon Sr. realized how much of a physical specimen he was. But then it wasn't all about his physique. No, with legitimate shoot skills, bucket loads of charisma, and the support of the Italian-American audience who made up a large part of WWF, Bruno was a clear superstar from day one. And so that was why his boss would begin pushing him straight to the top of the card in short order, with him giving him his world title in April of 1973. And we all know what happened after that, the longest WWE title reign in history, even more so than Hulk Hogan, Bob Backlund, or Roman Reigns, as for the next 2,803 days, almost 8 years, he'd hold that belt and defend it against all comers. It should go without saying then that this makes Bruno Sammartino one of the biggest stars WWE has ever had, someone who could easily sit on that Mount Rushmore of the company alongside names like Hulk Hogan, The Rock, and Steve Austin. Honestly, his run on top is a record that will almost certainly never be broken at this point, as it's hard to imagine anyone staying at such a level for so long in the current day. Does this make him the greatest international star to ever appear in WWE? Well, it certainly puts him in that short list, right there along with everyone else we've looked at today.